My sister-in-law fired me from her husband's family business. 30 minutes later, I deleted all my work data and left. The next day, my husband's family, in a state of chaos, called me 99 times only to hear the automated message. The number you have dialed is not currently in service. It was exactly 11 a.m. that day. I was sitting in the conference room of Anderson and Sons Furnishings across from my sister-in-law, Jessica Riley Anderson. The white ceiling light reflected off the long, cold glass table, making her face seem even more frigid. In front of me was a neatly placed sheet of paper with the bold title, Notice of Employment Termination. Jessica pushed the paper toward me with 2 fingers. Her voice was light, but each word was a knife in my ears. As of today, you no longer need to come to the company. The family business does not support saboteurs. I stared at the paper for a few seconds and then looked up at her. I was not paralyzed by fear or surprise. I simply found it ridiculous. Ridiculous because this place, this company they called my husband's family business, had been built on my savings, my expertise, and countless sleepless nights. My name is Ella Davis, and I am 34 years old. 6 years ago, Anderson and Sons Furnishings was just a small shop on a side street, specializing in selling a few pieces of furniture and home finishing materials. Back then, my father-in-law said he wanted to open a business so his sons would have something to do, but all he had was a rented storefront, a few old contacts, and a bank loan he didn't know how to manage. It was I who contributed $50,000 from my premarital savings and who personally built every single process. Inventory management, warehouse logistics, sales, customer service, data administration, and debt control. At the time, my husband, Jack Anderson, held my hand and said to me sweetly, "We're family. Honey, what do papers matter? In the end, the profits will be for the 2 of us." And I believed him. I believed in my husband, in his family, in the word family. Because of that trust, I did not demand to be listed as a shareholder. Because of that trust, I worked in silence, like the hidden axle that allowed the entire machine to run smoothly. But life is strange. When you are in misery, they call you a benefactor. When things get better, you start to be a nuisance. When Anderson and Sons Furnishings began to generate several $1,000,000 a year in revenue, my husband's family gradually changed. The one who changed the most was my sister-in-law, Jessica. She was the wife of the older brother, Charles Anderson, and held the title of Chief Operating Officer. But in reality, in the early years, she couldn't even read a simple inventory report. However, when the company had money, she started bringing in her own people. Her cousin was put in charge of purchasing, her niece in human resources, her best friend in accounts payable, and an acquaintance from her mother's side of the family was slipped into the warehouse department. People with real ability were sidelined, while flatterers took the important positions. On several occasions, I discovered that merchandise prices were being inflated, that packing slips did not match the quantities, and that shipping costs were being falsified. But every time I brought it up, Jessica would smile sarcastically. "You act as if you're the only one who knows numbers around here. Or maybe it just bothers you that Mom trusts me." In the meeting room that day, it wasn't just Jessica. My mother-in-law, Carol Miller Anderson, was seated at the head of the table, her face as cold as a coin. The older brother, Charles, sat next to his wife, his eyes fixed on his phone. My husband Jack was less than 6 feet away from me, but from beginning to end, he did not dare to look me in the eye. A few other in-laws remained silent, but their gazes judged me as if I were a criminal. My mother-in-law set her coffee cup on the table, her voice dry. "This family has fed you, given you a job, and you repay us by digging into the family's business. A daughter-in-law like you only brings ruin to a home." Hearing that, a lump formed in my throat. In 6 years, I had never taken a single cent from the company improperly. I had spent sleepless nights over orders. I had taken reprimands in place of employees. I had apologized to clients for delays and even once had to pawn my mother's gold necklace to get money to pay a supplier. And now, in my mother-in-law's mouth, I had become a parasite who had been done a favor. I turned to Jack. I expected him to say something, a single word, but he just lowered his head. His voice was so low, it was barely audible. "Just take a break for a while, let things cool down. Don't make the situation more tense." At that moment, I understood that they didn't care about right or wrong. They just wanted me to be quiet. I looked at each person in that room and asked slowly, "Are you all certain you want me to leave the company today?" Jessica gave a half smile and pushed a pen toward me. "It's not that we want to, it's a decision that's been made. Sign it so everything is settled for both parties. Don't make things uglier." I picked up the pen. My hand did not tremble. I signed my name on the paper clearly, stroke by stroke, without crying, without pleading, without arguing. When I finished, I put the pen down, looked Jessica straight in the eye, and said, "All right, from this moment on, everything related to Anderson and Sons Furnishings has nothing more to do with me." The room fell silent for a few seconds. Perhaps they didn't expect me to be so calm. Perhaps Jessica had prepared for a spectacle, to see me scream, beg, lose control, and become the laughingstock of the entire family. But unfortunately for her, I did not give her that satisfaction. I stood up, picked up my phone, adjusted my purse on my shoulder, and walked out of the conference room. Behind me, my mother-in-law snorted, and Jessica yelled, "If you're leaving, then leave for good. Don't think this company is going to fall apart without you." I paused at the door and turned to look at her one last time. I didn't argue, I just smiled very faintly. Because none of them knew that 30 minutes later, what they would lose would not just be a fired sister-in-law. They would lose the true brain that had kept Anderson and Sons Furnishings afloat for the past 6 years. I left the conference room, closing the glass door behind me. Inside, they remained seated, probably gloating about finally getting rid of the thorn in their side. I, on the other hand, went directly to my desk, the place that for 6 years had been almost my second home. It wasn't a large desk, but it had witnessed countless sleepless nights. The times I ate a cold lunch from a container while checking every inventory figure, every purchase order, every looming debt. On the desk were only a few old items, a small pot of succulents with slightly dry leaves, a white ceramic mug with a chipped rim, several notebooks filled with notes, a frame with a family photo of me, Jack, and our parents on the day the company opened. And next to it, my personal laptop, the one I always used in parallel with the company computer to run specific analyses that the old system couldn't handle. As I looked at each object, I felt a strange emptiness inside me. Not a pain that made me cry, but a coldness. Like a room where all the lights have just been turned off. The news of my firing spread faster than an internal memo. Some employees looked at me from afar, some with pity, others with fear, and some lowered their heads, pretending to be busy. In this company, everyone understood one thing. When Jessica wanted to get rid of someone, it was best not to appear close to that person. Beth, the head accountant, came to my side, her voice trembling. "Ella, did they really make you leave?" I looked up at her and nodded slightly, signaling for her to ask no more questions. It wasn't that I didn't trust her, but there were too many ears around us waiting to catch every word to report back to Jessica. I sat down and turned on the company computer one last time. The screen lit up, showing the familiar management interface. Before I left, I checked all the data belonging to Anderson and Sons Furnishings one last time. The client contracts were intact, the purchase orders, the inventory, the tax filings, the electronic invoices, the debt data, the delivery schedules, everything was in its place on the company server. I did not touch anything related to legal records, because I understood the difference between leaving with honor and becoming the guilty party. But what was mine was different. I opened my personal folder where I kept the analytical spreadsheets that, for years, only I had created, modified, and used. The real profit margin table, after deducting hidden costs, the product group loss alert file, the dynamic pricing model that helped the company know which items to stock and which to discontinue. The checklist for detecting merchandise with counterfeit labels, the script that automatically reconciled inventory, the list of reliable suppliers that I had painstakingly filtered from hundreds of contacts in the market. These things were not in my job description, they were not on the company server, and my husband's family had never paid me an extra cent for them. I looked at the screen for a long time, and then I deleted each folder, one by one, without rushing, without my hand shaking. Every time I clicked confirm, it was like cutting another thread that had tied me to this place. I was not sabotaging the company, I was just taking what was mine. Jessica wanted me to leave empty-handed, but she forgot that there are things not written in a contract that are the soul of the entire machine. After that, I logged out of all my personal accounts on the computer, my private email, my cloud storage, my note-taking software, the data reconciliation application whose license I had purchased myself. Everything was completely uninstalled. I removed the security USB from the port and put it in my purse. The notebooks with the operations manuals, I also placed them neatly in a cardboard box. In those pages were my 6 years of experience. The mistakes that almost cost the company clients, the way to handle situations that to an outsider were just cold numbers. Daniel, the systems technician, stood a few feet away, his face pale. He was a man of few words, but that day he couldn't hold back. He approached and asked in a very low voice, "Are you really leaving?" If you go, who's going to manage the profit dashboard? I looked at Daniel. In his eyes was genuine concern, not feigned curiosity. I answered him calmly. Whoever signed my termination papers will know how to make it work. Daniel pressed his lips together and said no more. Perhaps he understood that from that moment on, I would no longer be there to patch the holes they insisted on digging. At 11:30, I finished packing my things. A small cardboard box was enough for 6 years in this place. I hugged it and walked out of the work area, down the hallway. Some employees nodded at me very discreetly. Some had red eyes, others wanted to say something but held back. I didn't blame them. Everyone needs a salary to live. Not everyone can stand up to a family that holds both the money and the power in the company. When I passed the management office, Jessica was already at the door. She stood with her arms crossed, her lips painted a deep red, and said loudly, deliberately, so the whole office could hear, "If you're leaving, then leave for good. Don't think this company is going to fall apart without you." I stopped and turned to look at her. I could have said many things. I could have exposed every inflated expense, every overpriced order, every name of her relatives who had been bleeding the company dry in silence. But I said nothing. There are lessons people only learn when they pay the price for themselves. I just replied very softly, "I hope so, too." The smile on Jessica's lips froze. Her face darkened, but I gave no further explanation. I hugged my box and went straight to the elevator, leaving behind a mixture of curious, pitying, and uneasy glances. When I reached the lobby, the phone in my purse began to vibrate incessantly. Messages from Beth, from Daniel, from Laura in customer service, appeared one after another. I knew they were worried about me, and I also knew they feared what was to come. But at that moment, I didn't reply to anyone. I needed to disappear long enough for my husband's family to see for themselves the price of ignorance, for them to face the company they boasted they didn't need me for. Before walking out the door, I opened my phone settings and forwarded all calls to a not in service status. Then, I turned off the phone and put it in my purse. Outside, the midday sun beat down on the building's glass. I stopped for a few seconds, looking at the Anderson and Sons Furnishings sign hanging high above. 6 years of my youth were there, but from that instant, it was no longer my responsibility. If my husband's family called me 99 times or 999, the only thing they would hear would be a cold, distant phrase. "The number you have dialed is not currently in service." After leaving the Anderson and Sons building, I didn't go straight home. I walked down the street I knew so well. I passed the coffee shop where years ago, Jack and I had sat planning the first purchase orders. I passed the copy shop where I had printed so many quotes for clients. The midday sun hit the asphalt so brightly I had to squint, but what made my eyes sting wasn't the sun. It was the memories of the last 6 years, replaying like an old film. Back then, Anderson and Sons was not a major name. My father-in-law, Arthur Anderson, pooled his savings to open the business with a rented space at the end of the street, a few sample catalogs, and a bank loan hanging over his head. The older brother, Charles, was listed as the manager, but to be honest, he understood nothing about management. My husband Jack, at that time, only knew how to drive the delivery van, help with loading and unloading, and handle small tasks in the store. And my sister-in-law Jessica had no power back then. She was just a woman who liked to dress well and spout grand phrases about business, but if you handed her a cost-benefit analysis, she would stare at it as if it were written in another language. The person who truly built the foundation of the company was me. Before marrying Jack, I had worked as an operations manager at a distribution company. I understood that for a business to survive, it needed not just to sell, but to have processes for purchasing, controlling inventory, closing orders, serving customers, tracking debts, and managing cash flow. A small shop can run on instinct, but a company that wants to grow cannot be managed with memory and a few messy notebooks. I remember the first night I sat with my father-in-law in the warehouse. Mr. Arthur poured me a cup of coffee. His voice was grave. "Ella, in this family, no one handles paperwork and processes like you do. I'm asking you to help us for a while. When the company grows, this family will not forget your contribution." At that moment, those words comforted me. I thought that as a daughter-in-law, if I helped my husband's family prosper, I would also be helping to build a future for my own marriage. I contributed $50,000 from my premarital savings. It was the money I had saved over years of work, with which I had planned to buy a small apartment for myself. I didn't ask for a capital contribution agreement, I didn't demand to be listed as a shareholder, and I certainly didn't make them sign any commitment. Jack hugged me and whispered, "Trust me. We're a family." In the end, everything that belongs to my family will also be yours. And I believed him. Looking back now, I realize that a woman's trust is sometimes what makes you pay the highest price. The first few months, I practically lived at the company. In the morning, I opened the doors with the employees. At night, I was the last one to turn off the lights. I called every supplier for quotes. I negotiated every percentage point of discount. I adjusted every payment clause so the company wouldn't be choked by a lack of liquidity. I created the product codes myself. I trained the employees on how to enter data. I wrote the procedures for receiving orders, dispatching goods, delivering, and recording customer feedback. Sometimes I would come home close to midnight and still sit at the kitchen table with my laptop, warming up a bowl of cold soup while checking if any order for the next morning was missing an accessory. Once, I had a fever of almost 102. Jack told me to take the day off, but that morning we had an important delivery for a small hotel. If we got the wood color wrong, they would cancel the entire contract. I put on a coat, took a fever reducer, and sat in front of the computer, checking every code. My mother-in-law at that time even brought me a hot broth, saying with admiration, "This family's younger daughter-in-law is so dedicated. Without you, the whole family would be lost." At that moment, I just smiled, never imagining that one day the same person who said that would turn her back on me so quickly. The turning point came at the end of the first year. At that time, Anderson & Sons was still selling retail, with good days and bad. I realized that the mid-range furniture market was growing very fast, especially for corporate housing and luxury rental properties. I proposed that the company not just wait for retail customers to come in, but shift to a project-based supply model, offering complete packages with material lists, standardized quotes, clear timelines, and a defined warranty policy. At first, Charles dismissed it. He said we were too small for anyone to give us a project. But I didn't give up. I prepared a company portfolio myself. I took photos of the warehouse and drafted sample quotes for each segment. I contacted a private developer who was building a chain of furnished apartments and waited almost 3 hours just to meet with the purchasing manager. When they asked me what set my company apart, I didn't use grand words. I simply opened a comparative table of costs, delivery times, error rates, and return policies. It was that clarity that helped Anderson & Sons land its first project contract. The day we received the initial deposit, my husband's entire family was so happy that my father-in-law opened a bottle of wine to celebrate. And my mother-in-law held my hand and boasted to the neighbors, "My younger daughter-in-law is so smart." Since she arrived, the business has taken off. In the second year, revenue quintupled. Anderson & Sons opened a larger warehouse, bought a truck, renovated the office, and my husband's family started to have money to buy cars, change their furniture, go on vacation, and eat at expensive restaurants. During that time, I continued to work as always, even more than before. But I began to feel that the way they looked at me had changed. Before, they saw me as the savior of the company, later, as someone who controlled too many things. Jessica was the one who changed the fastest. She started to stand behind me whenever I prepared a report. She would pretend to ask something, but her eyes would stray to the screen. Once, during a family dinner, she said with a smile, "In a family business, having the younger sister-in-law control all the data is a bit strange, isn't it? If one day she gets angry about something, the whole family is left high and dry." The table went silent for a few seconds, and then my mother-in-law added, "Well, we also need to spread the work around so the family can control it." At that time, I still thought Jessica was just jealous because she didn't contribute much. I thought that since she wasn't the older one, she felt displaced seeing the younger one praised. I even offered to teach her how to read the reports, explaining each line item of revenue, costs, discounts, and debts. But Jessica didn't want to learn to understand, she just wanted to have the power. Later, I learned that behind my back, Jessica had secretly told my mother-in-law and Charles that they had to regain control. Otherwise, one day, the Anderson family business would be completely in the hands of the younger daughter-in-law. That sentence was like a poisonous seed that was planted. From then on, one by one, the in-laws' relatives began to be hired at the company, and also from then on, Anderson & Sons, the place I had once dedicated all my effort to save from scratch, began to rot from within. The first person Jessica brought into the company was her cousin, Marcus. Before that, Marcus only sold used cell phones in a small shop. He had a smooth tongue, but his knowledge of interior design materials was practically zero. However, after a family dinner, Jessica announced that Marcus would be in charge of purchasing, meaning he would have the power to choose suppliers, approve quotes, and propose stock purchases. When I heard that, I knew something was wrong. But I tried to stay calm and just asked quietly. Purchasing is the gateway to the whole company. Letting someone with no experience handle it, isn't that a bit rash, Jessica? Jessica put down her water glass and smiled coldly. Don't always act like you're the only one who knows about this. Marcus is family. He's trustworthy. No matter how good an outsider is, they'll never be like one of our own looking out for us. That sentence, at first glance, seemed reasonable. But I've been in this business long enough to know that in business, the word family cannot replace competence and transparency. The pity was that at that moment, my husband's entire family nodded as if she had just announced a great truth. 2 months later, the irregularities began to appear. Some of our star products, whose purchase prices had been stable, suddenly rose by 8 to 15%. Meanwhile, the quality, brand, and delivery conditions had not changed at all. I asked Marcus why the price was going up. He shrugged. The market fluctuates, Ella, everything is going up now. I asked to see the original quotes from the supplier. Marcus frowned instantly. You don't trust me. I follow Jessica's orders. If you have any doubts, ask her. I didn't argue at that moment. Silently, I compared every order, every invoice, and discovered that many purchases were no longer made directly from the manufacturer as before, but went through an intermediary company newly created less than 3 months ago. The representative of that company was a close friend of Marcus. The price from the manufacturer to the intermediary didn't change, but when selling to Anderson & Sons, a nice amount was tacked on, just enough to seem like a market fluctuation at first glance. But added up each month, it represented a figure that made my blood run cold. That night, I talked to Jack. I showed him the price comparison and the invoices with signs of irregularity. Jack looked at a few lines and sighed. He handed the phone back to me. Don't make things so tense. They're family. I'm sure they have their reasons. I looked at my husband, incredulous that this was his reaction. I asked him, a loss of thousands of dollars a month and you still call it having their reasons? Jack frowned. You always see the bad side of things. Jessica is my sister-in-law. Marcus is family. Are they going to harm their own company? I fell silent. The phrase, is family going to harm itself? Later became the excuse to cover up many dirty things. After Marcus, Jessica brought her niece Sarah into human resources. Sarah was barely 20. She was often late, but she was put in charge of recruiting for the customer service department. In just 1 month, the customer service department became a meeting place for Sarah's friends. Some didn't know how to talk to customers, others wrote down order information incorrectly. And some even did live streams on social media selling cosmetics while on duty at the call center. Customer complaints increased. One called to complain because they had been delivered a cabinet of the wrong color. Another asked for a return because the consultant had given them the wrong measurements. An old client said bluntly that he would not buy again. But the strange thing was that the reports sent to Jessica were always impeccable. The satisfaction index was stable. Negative ratings were low, and complaints were marked as resolved. Upon reviewing the original data, I discovered that many complaints had been reclassified as customer requests, more information, or customer cancels for personal reasons. Andy, the warehouse manager, was the first one who couldn't take it anymore. He had been in the warehouse for over 10 years and was so meticulous that he noted down every last missing screw in a batch. On several occasions, he reported missing merchandise, incorrect codes, and defective products with swapped labels. But every time he signed a report, the next day, Marcus would come down to the warehouse and shout at him in front of all the employees. Andy, you just make sure the ins and outs are correct. Don't think that just because you have a report in your hand, you can tell the purchasing department how to do their job. Once, I went down to the warehouse just as I saw Andy standing silently next to some empty shelves. With a stack of reports crossed out in red in his hand, he told me, his voice choked with emotion, Ella, I'm telling you the truth, the system says there's stock, but the warehouse doesn't have it. If something happens one day, don't let them put all the blame on the warehouse. That sentence hurt me. I knew that the people who really worked were starting to be afraid. Not of losing their jobs, but of becoming the scapegoat for those who were bleeding the company dry. I spent almost 2 weeks secretly reconciling data from purchase invoices, delivery slips, customer service reports, and supplier debts. Everything fit together to form a picture that was all too clear. The company was bleeding from the inside. Each month, the losses could amount to tens of thousands of dollars. If this continued, profits would erode, cash flow would break, and supplier debts would be added to the bank loan. I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. At the end of month family meeting, I placed the analysis table on the table. I didn't point fingers at anyone, I just presented the data. But as soon as she heard the phrase irregular purchasing costs, Jessica turned red and jumped to her feet. She pointed directly at me. Her voice trembled as if she were an innocent victim. Are you implying that I'm stealing? You're a daughter-in-law in this house, and you open your mouth to suspect your husband's family. What do you really want? I tried to keep my voice calm. I didn't say anyone was stealing. I'm just saying the company is losing money and we need to review the processes. But my mother-in-law slammed her hand on the table. Enough. The company's money belongs to the Anderson family. You are just a daughter-in-law. Don't think that because you know a few numbers, you can come and lecture us all. I looked at her with a lump in my throat. It turned out that after all these years, my effort had not been enough to earn me a little respect. Jessica burst into tears right after. She cried with great skill, just the right amount of tears, a choked voice. I know Ella is very smart, she said. I know everyone praises her, but I am also the older daughter-in-law of this house. I just want to help my in-laws manage the company. And she always acts as if I'm useless, as if this whole family has to work for her. My mother-in-law immediately hugged her to comfort her while giving me a look full of reproach. I turned to Jack once more. I hoped my husband would say something fair, but he just lowered his head, his hands clasped in silence like a spectator. That silence hurt me more than my mother-in-law's shouts, because I realized that in this marriage, when I needed him to stand on the side of reason, he chose the safest place for himself. After that meeting, my access to certain financial sections was restricted. Jessica sent out an internal memo, calling it a reassignment of permissions for professionalization, but I knew it was her way of blindfolding the only person who saw how they were bleeding the company dry. I didn't react. I just silently saved everything I could. Irregular invoices, altered quotes, messages with orders to modify data, photos of the actual inventory, reports before and after being modified. I didn't bring them to light. Not out of fear, but because I understood that with a family already blinded, my words would only make them hate me more. For them to wake up, reason was not enough. They had to fall into the hole they had dug themselves, get truly hurt. Only then would they understand that the person who had warned them was not a saboteur, but the last one who had wanted to save that company. The final straw came when Anderson & Sons was preparing to sign the biggest contract in its history with the hotel chain, Solstice Hospitality Group. It was a contract worth over $1 million, not just a large order, but a lifeline for the company at a time when cash flow was as tight as a violin string. If the contract went through, the company could pay off some of its supplier debts, rotate stagnant inventory, and maintain its market reputation for a while longer. But if it failed, I knew very well that the facade of prosperity my husband's family was trying to maintain would shatter in a few months. I was the person who had followed the Solstice contract from the beginning. Every technical clause, every warranty standard, every delivery deadline, every penalty for delay or incorrect material delivery. I knew it in detail. The people at Solstice were not easy. They were in the hospitality business, and every detail of the furniture had to be consistent. From the color of the wood and moisture resistance, to the load capacity and origin seals. With just one batch that didn't meet the standards, they had the right to halt reception, apply penalties, and demand compensation for damages. I had repeated this in countless meetings. However, just before finalizing the material purchase, Jessica unexpectedly signed the decision to entrust the main purchase to Marcus. I found out when I saw the modified supplier list in the system. The reliable suppliers I had worked with for years had been removed, and in their place was a new, unknown company. On paper, their prices were almost 12% lower, which at first glance seemed like a saving for the company. But with my experience, I knew that a product that is too cheap just when you need high quality is not usually an opportunity, but rather a trap. I asked the purchasing department to send a sample for comparison. As soon as I had the piece in my hands, I knew something was wrong. The surface looked similar, but it weighed less. The edges were not cleanly cut, and the moisture-resistant layer had a strange chemical smell. I scanned the QR code on the label, and the system returned a mismatch error with the original record. I checked the quality certificate and found that the scanned copy was blurry, right in the section with the production lot code. My heart sank. This was no longer a matter of inexperience in purchasing. It was a deliberate attempt at fraud. I immediately sent an email asking to halt the order and called Jessica. She answered with a very irritated tone. What is it now? I was direct. The batch for Solstice has problems. The QR code doesn't match, and the quality certificate is suspicious. It cannot be shipped. On the other end of the line, there was silence for a few seconds, and then she laughed. You really are an expert at sabotage. Just as we're about to sign the contract, you pull this stunt to stop the order. You can't stand that I'm the one in charge of this project, can you? I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I said, slow down, Jessica. This is $1 million contract. If we deliver incorrect material, we'll not only lose the penalty money, but the company could be sued. But she snapped at me. The company doesn't just depend on you to worry. Don't try to scare everyone with your codes and labels. And she hung up. That afternoon, an emergency meeting was called. I walked into the room and saw that my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, Charles, Jack, Jessica, and Marcus were already seated. The atmosphere was tense, but not because they were worried about the contract. They looked at me as if I were the cause of everything. Jessica threw a folder on the table, her voice sharp. From the beginning, this contract has been handled by Ella. If there are any mistakes, she must be the one responsible. I froze. In that instant, all the pieces fell into place in my head. They were not only bleeding the company dry, not only had they switched suppliers to pocket the price difference, but they had also prepared an escape route. If the fraud in the batch was discovered, they would use me as a scapegoat. My mother-in-law immediately supported her. That's right. You've handled the paperwork until now. If something happens, you explain it. Don't drag my family into this. I looked at Jack. He was sitting there, his face pale, but without saying a word to defend me. I asked him, each word so slow I could hear the coldness in my own voice. You want your wife to take the blame for others? Jack avoided my gaze, clenching his hands. After a moment, he whispered, I just want things to be resolved smoothly. Take some of the responsibility so this can be over. The company needs peace right now. That sentence was what made me completely cold. Some marriages don't die from a loud affair, but from a whispered phrase said at the very moment a woman most needs to be protected. I didn't argue further. I just gathered my documents, stood up, and said, all right. If you all want things to be resolved smoothly, I will let them be resolved smoothly, my way. That night, I didn't go straight home. I returned to the company after business hours, with the excuse of reviewing the Solstice documents one last time. The office was dark, lit only by the faint yellow lights from the hallway. I opened the system, checked the approval history, and discovered something that made my blood run cold. An internal account had used my digital signature to approve a draft order with incorrect specifications. The approval had been made at 9 p.m. the previous day. At that time, I was at my colleague Beth's house, helping her son with a school presentation, completely away from the company. I continued to check the access log. The IP address matched that of my workstation's computer. Clearly, someone had tried to create a false trail to make it look like I had approved it. I asked Daniel, the technician, for the hallway camera recordings under the pretext of an internal security review. Less than 20 minutes later, Daniel sent me a video. In the blurry image, I saw Sarah, Jessica's niece, sneaking into my office after everyone had left, with a folder and a small USB drive in her hand. I hadn't even recovered from the shock when Daniel sent me an audio recording. He wrote, listen to this. I didn't know if I should send it to you, but I'm afraid they'll hurt you. In the poor quality recording, Marcus's voice was clearly audible. Just let Ella approve the draft in the system. If anything happens, we'll blame her. She's been leading the project from the start. No one will be able to say otherwise. Then, Sarah's laugh. And if they find out? Marcus replied indifferently. Jessica will take care of it. Besides, we're family. Who's going to believe Ella over the entire Anderson family? I sat in front of the screen for a long time. Outside, the city lit up, cars continued to drive, people went on with their lives. And I, in that cold office, finally understood that they had gone too far. They no longer considered me family, nor did they simply want to push me out of the company. They wanted to use me as a shield to protect their greed. From that night on, I began to prepare my exit. I made legal backups of all the evidence related to the forged approval, the irregular invoices, the altered quotes, and the camera recordings. I made a list of the decent employees, the ones who actually worked and understood that the company was rotting. I locked all my personal accounts, separated the management tools I had created myself from the general system, ensuring that no one could use them to continue hiding false data. I also met secretly with a lawyer in a small coffee shop. I gave him the bank statement of the $50,000 transfer to the company, the messages in which Jack admitted it was my capital contribution, and the recording of my father-in-law saying that the company was what it was because of me. The lawyer, after reviewing everything, said only one thing: do not do anything rash. From now on, every step must be impeccable and legal, so that when they fall, they cannot drag you down with them. From that day on the surface, I continued to go to work as if nothing had happened. I attended meetings, presented reports, answered emails on time. I let Jessica think she had cornered me. I let my mother-in-law believe that with a little pressure, I would bend. I let Jack think that for the sake of our marriage, I would continue to endure. But inside, I knew very well that the day they fired me would come soon, and when it did, I would not cry, I would not beg, I would not cling to anything. I would simply leave. Cleanly and legally, without leaving them a single lifeline. And they would have to run the company with the same people they had blindly trusted. Just over 2 hours after I left Anderson & Sons, the machine, which seemed to be running normally, began to show its first cracks. By then, I was no longer at the company and had disconnected all calls, but later, from what Daniel told me, I learned how chaotic that afternoon was. The first thing was that the order management system started to crash repeatedly. Orders that had just been confirmed reverted to pending status. Some orders that had already been dispatched appeared as undelivered, and the inventory numbers danced as if someone were deliberately altering everything. The customer service department was the first to explode. Laura told me that in half an hour, the call center received nearly 40 calls. Customers were furious, and the employees didn't know what to say, because the screen showed one thing and the warehouse reported another. A regular bulk buying customer shouted over the phone. "Yesterday you told me there was stock. This morning I transferred the money, and now you're telling me there's none. What kind of business are you running?" The new employee hired by Sarah was trembling so much she stammered. She only knew how to repeat, "Yes sir, I'll check on it right now." But how could she check it if the system that had helped them see the truth until now was no longer working? Daniel, the technician, opened the profit dashboard to reconcile the orders, but the screen only showed a series of error messages. He tried restarting, reconnecting the database, running the usual reconciliation functions, but all the automated scripts I had written to check inventory, purchase prices, and profit margins had disappeared from my personal environment. Daniel turned pale. He knew that the company's data had not been deleted, but the private tools I used to keep the outdated Anderson & Sons system running had. He ran directly to Jessica's office, sweat beading on his forehead. "Ma'am, the reconciliation system Ella built is no longer working." Jessica, who was touching up her lipstick in a small mirror, frowned. "If it's not working, fix it. What does the company pay you for?" Daniel swallowed hard, his voice fading. "But Ella didn't transfer it to us. We only used the results. No one knows how it's structured inside. It's not purchased software, ma'am." That sentence made Jessica pause for a moment, but she immediately dismissed it. "Don't try to scare me. It's just a spreadsheet, not a state secret." She called Marcus on the phone, her voice still very confident. "Go down to the warehouse and check the merchandise. Anyone who dares to say something is missing, make them take responsibility." Perhaps at that moment, she still thought it was just a small glitch, that a little threat to the employees would solve it. But in the warehouse, the situation was much worse. Andy had ordered a check on 3 of the main products that were due for delivery that afternoon. In the system, quantities still appeared as available, but upon checking the shelves, half the spaces were empty. One item was missing over 100 sets of accessories, another had only empty boxes, with the contents swapped for defective products. Andy immediately called management. His voice was heavy as a stone. "Jessica, we need to block warehouse dispatches. If we deliver this afternoon based on the system data, there won't be enough for the large client, and the blame will fall on the warehouse." Marcus, hearing this, snatched the phone and interrupted. "Impossible that it's missing. The data I have is correct. Andy, don't exaggerate to scare us." Andy laughed indignantly. "Your data is on a piece of paper, but the empty shelves are right here in front of me. If you're so smart, come down and take the merchandise from the paper to deliver to the client." That sentence made the nearby warehouse employees fall silent. No one dared to laugh, but everyone understood that the truth, sooner or later, comes to light. Around 3 p.m., a VIP client called the main line directly. He was the owner of a chain of rental apartments who had ordered 200 sets of equipment with a fixed delivery date. As soon as Laura picked up, she heard a shout. "What kind of business are you people running? You promised delivery of 200 sets. And now the driver arrives and says merchandise is missing. I already have workers waiting at the site. Who is responsible for these losses? I'm going to sue you." Laura tried to explain, but the client wouldn't listen. He demanded to speak to the person in charge. The call was transferred to Jessica. At first, she tried to maintain a gentle tone. "Yes, sir. Please calm down. We will check on it immediately." But after a few sentences, her face turned as white as a sheet. The client was very clear: if everything was not delivered that same day, he would cancel all future orders and demand compensation for the construction delay. After hanging up, Jessica slammed the phone on the desk and shouted to the entire room. "This is all Ella's fault. She left, and the system went crazy. Is she sabotaging the company on purpose?" No one answered. Daniel, standing in a corner, pressed his lips together. Andy called from the warehouse again, demanding an immediate inventory report to avoid future accusations. Marcus, for his part, began to get nervous, first calling one supplier, then another carrier. But the more he called, the paler he became. Some batches he claimed to have received in full actually only had a provisional delivery note. The goods had never reached the warehouse. Other batches had arrived but had been diverted to another location as an internal adjustment without a valid confirmation signature. In 4 hours, Anderson and Sons went from a company gloating about firing me to a market on the brink of collapse. The call center was overwhelmed, the warehouse was paralyzed. The purchasing department couldn't explain the discrepancies, and accounting couldn't close the books due to a lack of reconciliation data. Those whom Jessica had previously considered low-level employees began to look at each other in bewilderment. They realized that the system where they clicked a few buttons each day to get results was actually supported by many layers of silent processing, and the person who knew those layers best had been fired without the slightest hesitation. It was then that Jessica remembered the phrase I had said to her at her office door. "I hope so, too." Perhaps that phrase began to echo in her head like a premonition. She picked up the phone and called me for the first time. Not in service. The second time, still not in service. The third, the fourth, the fifth. On the other end of the line, only the same monotonous, cold phrase could be heard. Jessica threw the phone on the sofa, but a few seconds later, she picked it up and called again. She didn't want to admit she needed me, and even less so did she want the employees to see her panic, but the slight tremor in her hand gave her away. Charles, beside her, his face tense, said, "Call Jack. Tell him to get Ella to come back." Jessica shot him a glare. "No need. She's just putting on a show. She thinks the company will die without her." But even as she said it, a fear she dared not name began to grow inside her, because in just a few hours, everything she thought she had under control was crumbling. And I, the person they had just called a saboteur, was the only one who had kept those pieces from falling. And at that moment, Jessica began to glimpse a bitter truth. Perhaps Anderson and Sons had never really worked without me. The next morning, as the sun was just rising, the cars from Solstice Hospitality Group were already parked in front of Anderson and Sons. It wasn't just one person, but an entire team consisting of the purchasing representative, the quality control technician, and the legal advisor. Normally, for these sample reviews, I was the one who received them. I prepared the documentation, the comparison samples, the certificates, and the contingency plans. But that day, the person in the lobby was Jessica, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit and a forced smile that couldn't hide her tension. The representative from Solstice was Mr. Thompson, a man in his 40s, soft-spoken but very incisive. He placed his briefcase on the table, looked around the conference room, and asked directly, "Where is Mrs. Davis? We have dealt directly with her until now." That first question froze Jessica's smile. She replied quickly, "We have recently reorganized our staff. I am the Chief Operating Officer, and I will be personally handling everything today." "Mr. Thompson said no more, just nodded slightly, but his gaze had grown a little colder. The samples were taken to the inspection room. The Solstice team brought with them a moisture meter, a strength testing machine, and the standard sample that I had sent them for approval. The atmosphere in the room was tense. Marcus stood behind Jessica, constantly running his hand through his hair, while Charles kept looking at his phone as if waiting for a miracle. After just a few minutes of inspection, the Solstice technician frowned, placed the panel on the table, measured it again with his device, and turned to Mr. Thompson. "This sample does not meet the requirements. The moisture-resistant layer is below what was agreed upon, and the strength does not meet the standard either." A short sentence, but it was like a lightning bolt that struck the middle of the room. Jessica hurried over. "Could you please check again? Perhaps the sample was affected during transport." The technician shook his head and brought out the standard sample to compare in front of everyone. The color was similar, but the internal core structure was completely different. Mr. Thompson picked up the panel, tapped it gently against the table. His voice was still calm, yet terrifying. "This is not the sample we approved. If this is the batch that is delivered, we will not only cancel the contract but also demand compensation according to the breach of quality clause. Jessica's face turned pale. The contract penalty was not a small figure. If Solstice activated the compensation clause, Anderson and Sons could have to pay up to $500,000. That's not counting the costs for the delay and the shattered reputation. They urgently called my father-in-law, Mr. Arthur. As soon as he entered the room and heard the figure of $500,000, he froze, grabbing the back of a chair. "How did we get to this point?" he asked in a hoarse voice. Jessica turned sharply to Marcus. Her gaze was as if she wanted to devour him. "Explain yourself. This is the merchandise you bought." Marcus stammered. Sweat ran down his temples. I bought it according to the approved price. It was you who told me to switch to this supplier because the price was better." The room fell silent. That sentence was like a slap in the face to Jessica. She stared at him with wide eyes, clenching her teeth. "What nonsense are you talking about?" Mr. Thompson looked from one to the other and closed his folder. "I don't care who approved what in your company. We just need a competent and honest supplier. From the beginning of the project, the only person who has given us confidence has been Mrs. Davis. We need to speak with her." The room fell into a deathly silence. No one dared to answer. My father-in-law turned to Jessica. "Call Ella." "Where is she? Where is she?" That question, though it seemed normal, was an admission to those present that in a moment of crisis, the first person they thought of was still me. Jessica pressed her lips together tightly until she finally managed to say, "She no longer works here." "Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "She left right before the final sample review?" No one answered. Mr. Thompson stood up. The sound of the chair scraping was cold and metallic. "In that case, we are sorry. Solstice Hospitality is temporarily suspending all collaboration with Anderson and Sons until there is an independent audit. Furthermore, our legal department will be sending an official notification regarding the non-compliance of the samples." With that, he and his team left the room. The door closed softly, but it left behind a ticking time bomb hanging over the heads of my husband's entire family. That afternoon, everything collapsed at once. The bank called to remind them that a loan of nearly $400,000 was about to mature. The company had planned to use the initial deposit from the Solstice contract to maintain cash flow, but now that the contract was suspended, that money had vanished as if it had never existed. The accountant checked the account balance and told Charles, "If no new money comes in, we won't have enough to pay salaries at the end of the month, let alone the debts." Suppliers also began to apply pressure. One sent a notice to stop deliveries because Anderson and Sons was 2 payments behind. Another demanded immediate payment for the previous batch before sending the new one. Someone even said bluntly over the phone, "I heard you're having trouble. In these times, it's better to be cash on delivery. I don't dare give you any more credit." In the warehouse, Andy received a message from a trusted partner. "I've heard things are very messy over there. Just a heads up, suppliers are telling each other. If you can still get out, save yourself while you can." Andy read the message and silently put his phone away. News of the company's instability spread faster than any official announcement. Employees began to whisper in the hallways, in the restrooms, in the warehouse. "Without Ella, this is chaos. She was strict before, but everything was clear. Who's going to take responsibility now?" And Jessica, the woman who the day before had stood in front of me saying the company wouldn't fall apart without me, began to call me nonstop. The 10th call went unanswered. The 20th, too. By the 30th, on the other end of the line, only that monotonous phrase could be heard, like adding more fuel to the fire. She threw the phone on the sofa in a rage, but picked it up again and kept calling like a madwoman. For the first time, Jessica lost her usual arrogance. The makeup was still on her face. Her dress was still elegant, and her title of Chief Operating Officer was still on her doorplate. But all of that suddenly felt empty. Because when $1 million contract vanishes, when the bank demands debt payment, and when suppliers turn their backs on you, that's when you understand that power isn't about sitting in a high chair and giving orders. The real power lies with the person who knows how to keep the entire machine from collapsing. And that person, at that moment, was no longer answering the phone. That night, my husband's family held an emergency meeting at my in-laws' house. It was supposed to be a family gathering, but it felt more like a trial, with the difference that the accused was not present. And those who sat as judges were the same ones who feared being discovered. The living room was brightly lit. But the atmosphere was so heavy that anyone entering would feel suffocated. On the table were phones, the Solstice contract, the payment demand from the bank, and several freshly printed error reports from the company. Jessica was the first to speak. She slammed the table, her voice sharp with rage. This is all Ella's fault. She deleted the data, sabotaged the company. She purposely waited for the big contract moment to strike. My mother-in-law immediately joined in, as if she had been waiting for someone to say it. Carol Anderson gritted her teeth. I told you so. You can't trust that kind of daughter-in-law. You raise a snake in your own house, only to have it bite you. In just one day, I went from being the person who had held the entire machine together to being the culprit in their mouths. They completely forgot the years I worked to exhaustion. They forgot every time I saved the company from failing orders. They just needed a name to blame. And that name was mine. But that night, not everyone was blind enough to stay silent. They called Daniel, the technician, to explain the system failure. He stood in a corner of the living room, his hands clasped, his face tense. When Jessica pointed at him and asked, "Was it Ella who deleted the data?" Daniel swallowed and said in a very low voice, "Ella did not delete the company's data. The contracts, invoices, orders, inventory, it's all still there. She only deleted her private files and personal tools." The entire room fell silent. That sentence was like a knife that cut through the drama Jessica was trying to stage. She immediately shouted, "Shut up. Without those files, does the system even work?" Daniel lowered his head and did not respond, but his silence was the clearest answer. No, it did not. The company they boasted they didn't need me for turned out to depend on the things they had never valued. The older brother, Charles, was when he truly began to panic. He sat on the sofa, his hair disheveled, his voice breaking. What if the client really sues us? What if Solstice files a lawsuit? And the IRS, and the bank, and the suppliers? Who is going to take responsibility? For the first time, my father-in-law did not blame me or immediately defend Jessica. Mr. Arthur sat in silence, his hands trembling on his knees. Perhaps at that moment, he understood that this was no longer a matter of a rebellious daughter-in-law or family conflicts. But it was already too late. Just as everyone was arguing, Charles's phone buzzed with a new email from the company's general account. He opened it, and his face instantly changed color. The email contained only a short, unsigned line. The Anderson & Sons system shows signs of purchasing price fraud and inventory loss. We will forward the evidence to the proper authorities if the company continues to conceal it. Jessica snatched the phone to read it. Her face, which had been red with anger, turned white as wax. She understood better than anyone that those words were not an empty threat, because everything mentioned in the email were the things I had warned them about in previous meetings. Inflated purchase prices, mismatched inventory, intermediary invoices, modified reports. The things they had dismissed as sabotage now came back like bricks falling on them. Marcus, sitting in a corner, was secretly typing on his phone. He thought no one noticed, but Daniel clearly saw that he was deleting messages and transaction history. He was erasing conversations with suppliers, photos of transfers, exchanges with the intermediary company. But the more he deleted, the more his hands trembled. An innocent person would not panic like that. My mother-in-law still clung to her stubbornness. She pointed at the email. Her voice was shaky but still full of bitterness. This is all a setup by Ella. She left, and the problems started. Since she can't have it, she destroys it. But this time, no one immediately supported her, not even Jack, who just remained with his head down and his lips pressed together. Perhaps in his mind, he was beginning to remember the times I showed him the evidence. The times I told him the company was bleeding, the times he told me not to make the situation tense. And then something else happened. The accounts payable system managed by Sarah had a synchronization error, exposing a series of expenses without valid receipts. Money for transportation costs was being transferred to the same personal account. Consulting fees from suppliers matched the account number of an acquaintance of Marcus. Some receipts even had backdated dates to match monthly reports. Beth, the head accountant, looked at the printout and said only one sentence that sent a chill down everyone's spine. If the IRS comes in to review this, no one will be able to say it was a mistake. Around midnight, a former employee who had left posted on social media, exposing Anderson & Sons. The post did not mention my name, but it described in detail how the company used low-quality materials in contracts, forced employees to change the status of complaints, and covered up the mistakes of family members. Within hours, the post was widely shared in interior design industry groups. The most terrifying thing was that every detail matched what I had said. It was then that my husband's family fell into true chaos. It was not just the loss of the contract, not just the lack of money, but the legal threat hanging over their heads. Once a client sues, the IRS investigates, suppliers report debts, and former employees speak out. Anderson & Sons would cease to be a struggling company, it would become a nest of problems exposed for all to see. And I, in the midst of all that chaos, had completely disappeared. My phone was unavailable. I had not returned home. I was not responding to messages. They had thought that by throwing me out the door, everything would be solved, but they did not know that when I left, I had taken the most important thing with me: sanity, integrity, and my own survival. While my husband's family descended into chaos, calling me again and again without success, I was sitting in a quiet coffee shop, nearly 6 miles from my old company. The place was on a small street, not too crowded, and the soft music was perfect for covering conversations that needed to be kept low. Across from me were Beth, the head accountant, Andy, the warehouse manager, Daniel, the systems technician, and Laura from customer service. They were the people I trusted most at Anderson & Sons, not because they had publicly defended me, but because I knew they still retained their professional ethics. Beth had refused on several occasions to sign off on expenses without proper receipts. Andy had been yelled at in the middle of the warehouse but still insisted on reporting missing merchandise. Daniel was the one who secretly sent me the recording of Marcus planning to blame me. And Laura, the youngest of the group, had cried several times because she was forced to change the status of customer complaints to resolve satisfactorily. I left my turned-off phone on the table, looked at each of them, and asked directly, "If Anderson & Sons goes under, what do you plan to do?" The question left them silent. It wasn't that they hadn't thought about it, but perhaps no one had dared to say it out loud. After a few seconds, Beth smiled sadly. Her eyes reflected exhaustion. "If I stay there, sooner or later, they will use me as a scapegoat. They sign the papers, but the first person they call for an explanation will be the accountant." Andy put down his coffee cup. His voice was grave. "I've been in warehousing for over 10 years, and I've never seen such a chaotic company. There's merchandise on paper, but not on the shelf. The one who tells the truth gets reprimanded. The one who makes mistakes is protected. Staying there means ending up in jail for others." Daniel, beside him, nodded, his face still tense from the recent events. "I know the system you built well. If you don't come back, they won't be able to save it. But I also know that if you do come back, they will pin all the blame on you." Hearing their words, I felt no joy. Seeing a company that was my passion now destroyed by those who called themselves family is no cause for celebration for anyone. But I was not weak enough to go back and patch the holes they continued to dig for their own benefit. I looked at everyone and said slowly, "I'm not going back. I'm going to start something new." The 4 of them stared at me. Laura's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" I nodded. From my purse, I took out a blue folder and placed it on the table. Inside were not proofs against my husband's family, nor stolen documents from the old company. It was the plan I had been secretly preparing for the last 3 months. A list of reliable suppliers with whom I had built a relationship based on my personal reputation, a market analysis for the next 2 years, an optimized management model for a small company but with strict cash flow control, and a list of clients who had told me directly that they worked with Anderson & Sons because they trusted me. I pushed the folder toward them. My voice was calm. "I've been preparing this for the last 3 months." Beth was stunned. "You knew they were going to fire you?" I looked out the window, where the streetlights reflected on the asphalt, wet from a recent rain. I didn't know the exact day, but ever since they restricted my access to put their relatives in charge of purchasing and used my account to approve fraudulent order drafts, I knew they would do it sooner or later. I just didn't want to wait for them to push me off the cliff to start looking for a way out. The atmosphere at the table became heavy, but it was no longer one of despair. It was as if a new door had just opened. Daniel skimmed through the documents. His eyes lit up when he saw the diagram of the new system. "You plan to build a new foundation from scratch?" I nodded. "No patches, no reliance on loose files. Every access permission must be clear. Every change must be logged. Every expense must have a receipt. We may be small, but we will not be opaque." Andy looked at the supplier list and frowned. "Many of these suppliers preferred to work with you. But if they find out you've gone out on your own, will they dare to collaborate?" I replied, "I'm not asking them to leave anyone. I'm just offering them to do things right. Those who want to sell quality products, with clear payments and no hidden commissions, will choose." Laura hesitated. "And what about the clients? Will they accuse us of stealing them?" I looked at Laura seriously. "No one will illegally take client data. Those who come to us because they trust our reputation will do so by their own choice. We're starting over, but cleanly. That's what I had repeated to myself from the beginning. I didn't want to leave one swamp to build another. I didn't need to win by playing dirty like them. I just needed to follow a path that, looking back, wouldn't make me hang my head. Beth picked up the folder, read it for a while, and asked in a very low voice, "Are you sure Anderson and Sons will sink?" I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the fake invoices, the poor quality batches, the bank loan, the Solstice contract hanging by a thread, and those people who only knew how to protect each other instead of saving the company. Finally, I said, "They have already sunk. They just haven't realized it yet." That sentence left them silent. No one refuted it because they had all seen with their own eyes how hollow the foundations of Anderson and Sons were. I looked at them and said, word for word, I don't need Anderson and Sons. I need a team that is sensible enough. Come with me. I don't promise immediate wealth, or an easy path, and certainly not that there won't be hard work. But I promise one thing. In my company, no one will have to falsify data to please family. No one will have to sign blank papers to cover a boss's mistakes, and no one will be used as a scapegoat for the greed of others. Laura was the first to nod. She said softly, but firmly, "I'm with you." Daniel placed his hand on the folder. "Me too." Andy just smiled. A smile that hadn't been seen on his face in days. "I'm old. I don't like changing jobs, but working with people who know right from wrong is worth it." Beth looked at me with red eyes. "So, where do we start?" I opened the last page of the folder. There was the name I had been thinking about for a long time. Trustline Projects. It wasn't a flashy name, but it was what I wanted to preserve after everything. Trust for the clients, trust for the employees, and trust for myself. While my husband's family was still calling me up to the 99th call, while Jessica still thought I was hiding in fear, a new company was being born at that small coffee shop table, without noise, without fanfare, but with complete clarity. I was no longer standing in the rubble waiting for pity. I was rebuilding something completely new from the ashes they had left behind. 3 days later, Anderson and Sons received the official notification from Solstice Hospitality Group. It was no longer a temporary suspension of collaboration, as had been said in the meeting, but a complete termination of the negotiation process, with the company also reserving the right to demand compensation if it was proven that Anderson and Sons had intentionally provided samples of inferior quality. The document arrived via email to the company at 8:17 a.m. The first to open it was Beth, but by then, she was no longer surprised. She simply printed it, left it on Charles's desk, and said a single sentence, "You should call a lawyer before you call the client." Charles picked up the paper, his face pale as if he had lost all his blood. The words termination of collaboration hit him in the eyes. Dragging everything else into the abyss, the $1 million contract had vanished. The initial deposit they were counting on to fix their cash flow had also disappeared. The plans to pay debts, buy merchandise, and pay salaries collapsed like a house of cards. He hadn't even recovered when the bank called. The credit manager's voice was polite, but each word was as cold as a knife. If the company did not provide liquidity to secure the loan within the established deadline, the bank would proceed to review the mortgaged assets and apply the recovery measures stipulated in the contract. Charles, upon hearing this, broke into a cold sweat. Before he hung up, a longtime supplier sent a certified letter demanding immediate payment of the outstanding debt. It was not a friendly call or a verbal reminder. It was a document with an official stamp warning that if payment was not made in 3 days, they would initiate legal action. The entire Anderson and Sons office that day was a pressure cooker. The phones rang off the hook, emails poured in, and employees rushed back and forth with tense faces. Some demanded money, others canceled contracts. Some asked about their orders, others about their paychecks. And Jessica, sitting in her office with 3 phones in front of her, became more and more entangled. She would call Marcus, and the phone was off. She would call the new supplier, and no one answered. She would call the carrier, and they would say they hadn't received the full shipment. Every call was a bucket of cold water. Around noon, another piece of news shook the company. The IRS sent a summons for an inspection due to indications of irregularities in purchase invoices, especially in transportation costs, consulting, and purchases through intermediaries. Beth took the summons, went into the office, and placed it in front of Jessica. Jessica read it, pressed her lips together, and suddenly shouted, "Why are you looking at me? You handle the accounting. You handle the papers, and now that there are problems, you come to scare me?" Beth looked at her. Her voice was serene. "I handle the papers, but I'm not the one who approves the expenses. You should remember that digital signatures and transfer orders have a record. That sentence left Jessica speechless. In that instant, the arrogance on her face cracked. Marcus had disappeared since early morning, without asking for permission, without calling in sick, without answering messages. Sarah sent her resignation via email, citing stress and the inability to continue. The two people Jessica had called trusted family were the first to flee when the ship started to burn. The other employees saw the scene and felt a shiver. Everyone understood that the ship was sinking and that those who had drilled the holes were trying to jump first. That afternoon, my father-in-law called me for the first time. Mr. Arthur rarely called me, always maintaining his patriarchal air. If he had something to say, he did it through Jack or my mother-in-law. But that day, he called me 10 times in a row. On the other end of the line, only the same mechanical, insensitive phrase could be heard. He put down the phone and sat dejectedly on the sofa. My mother-in-law paced the living room, muttering, "Call her. Tell her to come back. Ella knows how to handle these things with papers, the warehouse, clients. She has always solved everything." It was the first time she had referred to me without shouting. In her voice was real panic. But also something belated and pathetic. Hearing her, Jessica jumped to her feet, her eyes bloodshot. "No need. The company can survive without her. Stop saying Ella, Ella all the time. Who does she think she is that we have to beg her?" But just as she finished speaking, Beth came in. Her voice was not loud, but it was enough to silence the entire room. "If no money comes in this week, the company won't be able to pay salaries, and if no agreement is reached with the suppliers, there will be no merchandise to sell next month." The silence was deafening. Beth's words were not a threat, but the stark reality. A company that on the outside still had a sign, an office, and employees, but on the inside was without money, without clients, without merchandise, and without trust. The internal disintegration began at that moment. The most competent employees started to submit their resignations, some citing family reasons, others saying they had found another job. But everyone knew they didn't want to go down with a sinking ship. The reputation of Anderson and Sons plummeted faster than they imagined. Former clients told each other, suppliers spread the word, and the post denouncing the company continued to circulate in industry groups. Just a few days ago, my husband's family had fired me as if getting rid of a useless object. Now they had to watch as the walls they themselves had built crumbled before their eyes. That night, Jack sent me a very short message, but one I read for a long time. "I'm sorry. Could you come back so we can talk?" I read it and put the phone down without replying. Not because it didn't hurt me, but because I had already suffered enough. They didn't need me when I was there, they only needed me when everything started to fall apart. And now, with an abyss called in-laws on one side and a new path I had just opened for myself on the other, I knew I couldn't turn back. After 3 days of being gone from Anderson and Sons, I didn't return to the company or the house I once called home. I rented a small apartment in an old building on the outskirts of town, neither luxurious nor spacious, but quiet enough that I no longer had to listen to the screams, accusations, or pleas of my husband's family. The first night, in that unfamiliar bed, I lay awake almost until dawn. Not out of fear, but because I knew that from that moment on, there was no turning back. The next morning, I put on a white blouse, tied my hair back, and went to the office of my lawyer, Mr. Evans. He had been secretly advising me for the past 3 months, ever since I began to realize that my husband's family not only wanted to push me out of the company but also intended to use me as a scapegoat if everything came to light. His office was not large, but it was neat and quiet. On the wall hung several degrees and a clock that ticked with a regularity that calmed me. On the table in front of us were 3 thick folders. The first was the divorce petition. The second was the documentation proving my $50,000 contribution to Anderson and Sons. The third was the evidence related to the misappropriation of funds, the falsification of data, the merchandise fraud, and the use of my internal account to approve fraudulent order drafts. I looked at those 3 folders and felt that my 6 years of youth were packed into those cold pages. I used to live on trust. Now I was forced to save myself with evidence. The lawyer, Mr. Evans, turned the pages, adjusted his glasses, and said bluntly, "You are not listed as a shareholder. That's a disadvantage. But the bank statement, your husband's messages, and the recording with Mr. Arthur's confirmation are enough to prove there was a real contribution. As for the use of your internal account, if we cross-reference the access log and the cameras, we can demand an explanation." I nodded. Strangely, I was no longer trembling as I had in the first days when I discovered the setup. Perhaps when you are cornered to the limit, fear turns into clarity. I signed the divorce petition first. My stroke was quick and decisive, so much so that even I was surprised. For me, that marriage hadn't died when Jessica fired me, nor when my mother-in-law called me an outsider. It died the moment Jack, sitting in that conference room, watched me being pressured to take the blame for others, and only said, "Take some of the responsibility to make it easier." That sentence cut the last thread of affection I had left. When I finished, I picked up my phone and sent a short message to Jack. "This afternoon, my lawyer will be sending the divorce petition. From now on, all communication will be through him." Barely a minute after sending it, the phone lit up. It was Jack. I saw his name on the screen, but my heart no longer clenched as it used to. I let it ring until the call went to voicemail. Shortly after, he texted me again. "By doing this, you are backing my entire family into a corner." I read and reread that sentence, then smiled faintly. Even at that moment, he still thought I was the one cornering them. He didn't see the inflated expenses, the fraudulent merchandise, or the cover-up by his mother and sister-in-law. He only saw that I was no longer willing to be their shield. I replied, "Your family got there on their own. I'm just no longer at the bottom to cushion the fall." After sending it, I placed the phone face down on the table, not waiting for his reply. At the same time, Mr. Evans sent a notice on my behalf to Anderson and Sons. The content was very clear. It requested the company to account for the $50,000 contribution I had made, to clarify the use of my management work over the years, and to provide information about the unauthorized use of my internal account outside of business hours. There were no insults or threats, but each line was enough to give sleepless nights to those trying to hide the truth. That afternoon, the notice arrived at the company. Laura later told me that Jessica received a copy. She read it, and her face turned red with anger. She tore the paper into pieces in front of the employees, shouting, "Does she think hiring a lawyer will scare me? This company belongs to the Anderson family. Who does she think she is to demand explanations?" No one dared to answer, but unlike other times, the silence this time was not just of fear. It was of anticipation, waiting to see how much longer the woman who had just torn up the paper could continue to deny everything. That same afternoon, Beth discreetly sent the lawyer a new batch of evidence. It was a comparison of the inflated expenses, the anomalous transportation costs, and the transfers to the intermediary company directly linked to Marcus. In particular, on some of the payment orders, the final approval was from Jessica herself. Upon opening the file, Mr. Evans looked at me for a long time and said, "Mrs. Davis, from now on, this case is no longer just an internal family dispute." I said nothing, just looked at the figures on the screen, feeling a coldness inside. I had hoped that at least some in my husband's family had made mistakes out of blindness, but the deeper I dug, the clearer the truth became. It wasn't blindness. Some knew they were doing wrong and went ahead. Others saw the profit and signed with their eyes closed, and others, seeing my warnings, tried to silence me. At the end of the day, Anderson and Sons received another summons from the IRS. This time, the person required to appear was not me or the head accountant Beth, but Jessica Riley Anderson, Chief Operating Officer. They say that when she read her name, she froze in the middle of the office, the paper trembling in her hands. And I, sitting in my small apartment, closed the folder in front of me. I knew that from that day on, I was no longer the one kicked out of the game. I had begun my counterattack, without noise, without shouting, without crying in front of anyone. Simply by doing something very simple, shining a light on the dark corners that my husband's family thought they could keep hidden forever. That night, as I was making a cup of ginger tea in my small rental apartment, the doorbell suddenly rang. It rang insistently, hurried, and chaotic. As if the person on the other side had lost all patience. I looked through the peephole and saw Jack. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his face more gaunt than a few days ago. His hand kept pressing the bell while he tried to call me on his phone, even though he knew I wouldn't answer. I didn't open the door immediately. I stood still, listening to his hoarse voice calling my name. "Ella, I know you're in there. Open up. I just want to talk for a moment." A neighbor opened their door, glanced out, and closed it again. Jack must have realized he was causing a disturbance and started knocking on the door. His voice was lower, but increasingly desperate. Nearly an hour later, I opened the door. I only opened it a crack, not stepping back to invite him in. Jack looked at me with a mixture of joy and sorrow in his eyes, as if seeing me was like finding a lifesaver. He spoke immediately. His voice was hoarse. "Ella, I know I was wrong. Please, come back. The company is a mess. My mother hasn't slept in days. My father's blood pressure is through the roof. Charles is on the verge of a breakdown." I looked at the man who had been my husband and asked him calmly, Do you need your wife, or do you need someone to save your family's company? Jack was speechless. The question hit him right where he was weakest. He opened his mouth to say something, but in the end, he just lowered his head. I smiled bitterly. His silence, once again, was the clearest answer. I continued. Each word slow, but sharp. The day they fired me, you sat there. The day they blamed me, you also sat there. The day your mother called me a saboteur, you continued to sit there. By what right do you ask me to come back now? Jack looked up, his eyes red. I was trapped between my mother, my sister-in-law, and you. I didn't know what to do. I really didn't. I looked at him, no longer with anger, but with a deep weariness. A man who doesn't know how to defend what is right should not use the excuse of being trapped. You weren't trapped, you chose. It's just that now your choice is costing you. Jack fell silent, his arms hanging limp at his sides. At that moment, his phone rang. My mother-in-law's name appeared on the screen. He tried to silence it, but I had already seen it. Jack hesitated for a few seconds and answered. As soon as the video call connected, Carol's shrill voice echoed. Did you find her? Tell her to come back now. As long as she is a daughter-in-law of this family, she has to save it. If the company sinks, does she think nothing will happen to her? I stepped closer and looked directly at the phone screen. My mother-in-law's face was contorted with anger and panic. For the first time, she lacked her usual air of superiority, but her words were still just as venomous. I said, word for word, I am filing for divorce. From now on, I am no longer your daughter-in-law. Carol froze for a few seconds, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. Then she screamed, you ungrateful wretch. My family gave you the opportunity to work, gave you status. And now that you see your in-laws are in trouble, you turn your back on them? I looked at her. My voice remained serene. I earned that opportunity with my money and my work. You all just sat at the table to eat and complain about the cook. Do not confuse my effort with your family's charity. Jack quickly ended the call, as if afraid his mother would make things even worse. He looked at me, his voice almost pleading. Ella, I'm not asking you to forgive me now, but at least help the company get through the solstice issue, please. You just have to talk to them, get the system running again. Afterward, if you want, we can get a divorce. I shook my head. I am not going back to clean up the mess they deliberately created. The solstice contract is tainted. From the merchandise to the certificates to the approval. If I get involved now, it would be like putting a noose around my own neck. Jack was speechless. He wanted to argue, but he knew I was right. I looked at him one last time and said more slowly, but since you were once my husband, I will give you one last piece of advice. Do not co-sign any more loans for the company. Jessica is getting your whole family into debt with loan sharks. Jack froze. His expression changed completely. From pleading to panic. Loan sharks? What are you talking about? What debt? I gave him no further explanation. There are things that if he wanted to know, he would have to ask his own family. I just replied, go and ask Charles. Ask Jessica. Ask them where the deed to your parents' house is. With that, I stepped back. Jack put his hand on the door to stop me from closing it. His voice trembled. Ella, if you know something, tell me everything. I looked at his hand and remembered all the times I had wished that hand would protect me from my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, but it never had. I gently but firmly removed his hand from the edge of the door. It's late, Jack. This time, you have to see it for yourself. I closed the door. Behind it, I heard him stand there for a long time. Then the sound of his hurried footsteps faded away. About 10 minutes later, my phone lit up with a message from Jack. Just a few words. Charles won't answer. Is it true they mortgaged the deed? I didn't reply because from that moment on, the gears of the Anderson family had begun to crush the very ones who sat on top of them. And Jack finally had to enter the dark room he had ignored for so long. Jack rushed to his parents' house that same night. He later told his lawyer that upon entering, he heard my father-in-law shouting from the living room. It wasn't a normal shout of anger, but the voice of someone who had just discovered their house was on the edge of a cliff. Before the door closed, Jack saw his parents, his brother Charles, and Jessica standing around the large wooden table. Everyone's face was pale. On the table was a loan agreement with signatures and fingerprints, and a photocopy of the deed to his parents' house. It included a daily interest payment schedule. The loan amount was $200,000, but what made Jack's blood run cold was not the figure, but an interest rate so high that with just a few weeks of delay, the debt would inflate like an uncontrollable monster. My father-in-law, Mr. Arthur, held the photocopy of the deed with trembling hands, his eyes bloodshot as he looked at Charles and Jessica. He asked in a hoarse voice, "Who gave you permission to mortgage the deed to this house?" Charles lowered his head, his face gray as ash. Jessica, however, tried to remain calm, though her lips were trembling. She said, "I did it to save the company. If we didn't take out a loan, where would we get the money for the merchandise and to pay the bank? Do you think I wanted to do it, Dad?" If an outsider had heard that, they might have thought Jessica was a hero. But at that moment, Jack's phone buzzed. It was Beth, who had sent him a file with a message. "If you still want to know the truth, look at this before you sign anything else." Jack opened it. The bank statements were clear. The $200,000 loan had not gone to the company's account to pay the bank or suppliers, as Jessica claimed. It had been split and transferred to two intermediary accounts, one of which was directly linked to Marcus. Jack threw the phone on the table, his eyes red. "Jessica, where is the money?" The room fell into a deathly silence. Jessica froze for a second, then fought back. "You've been listening to Ella. She's abandoned you, and you still believe her. She wants to divide our family." Jack snapped. "Don't bring Ella into this. I asked you where the money is." To that question, Jessica could not answer. And just as the family was arguing, the screech of brakes was heard outside. It wasn't one car, but 3 black cars that stopped in front of the house. Several men got out, dressed unassumingly but with cold gazes. The one in front, about 40 years old, had a scar on his cheek and walked slowly, as if the whole house was already his. I later learned they called him Scar. He didn't shout or break anything, he simply walked into the living room, placed another loan agreement on the table, and said in a very low voice, "If there's no money tomorrow, this house changes hands." My husband's entire family froze. It was precisely that soft voice that was terrifying. It wasn't an impulsive threat, but a sentence already passed. My mother-in-law swayed and had to grab a chair to keep from falling. She turned to Jessica, her voice breaking. "You said it was just a temporary loan for 1 month. You said as soon as you got the money from Solstice, you would pay it back." That sentence froze the room. Jack looked at his mother, and Mr. Arthur turned to his wife with an expression of disbelief. It turned out that Carol knew about the loan. She knew the deed had been mortgaged, but she had hidden it from her husband and her son. Only because she trusted that Jessica would fix it. "Mr. Arthur slammed the table with such force that the water glass jumped. "So you knew too? It turns out the only fool in this house was me." My mother-in-law burst into tears, but her tears no longer moved anyone because her blind favoritism had helped lead them to this situation. Scar sat down, looked around, and smiled disdainfully. "Are you done with the family drama yet? I don't care who knew what. I just want my money." Charles approached, trembling, almost on his knees. "Please, give us a few more days. The company is in trouble, but we will get the money. Please, understand. My family is going through a hard time." Scar looked at him without a hint of compassion. "You were very quick to sign. Now you ask me for compassion to pay. I do business, not charity." At that moment, the landline rang again, its ringing echoing like a bad omen. Charles answered with a trembling hand. After a few words, his face turned even paler. The IRS was informing him that they would be conducting a surprise inspection of the warehouse and documents related to the irregular invoices the next morning. With loan sharks at the door, an IRS inspection the next day, and Solstice preparing a lawsuit, they were trapped between 3 fires. Jessica finally lost control. She screamed that it was all Marcus's fault, that he had acted on his own, that she had only signed the reports he presented. But Marcus had disappeared. His phone was off, his house was locked, and his social media was silent. Just as Jessica was screaming, her phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. A single line, but enough to make her collapse onto the sofa. "Don't drag me down with you. I have enough paperwork to put you in jail." That message was the final blow. It turned out that Marcus had not only embezzled from the company and transferred the money, but he had also kept copies of the fake documents, the messages with the orders, and the approvals signed by Jessica. The person she had brought in as her right-hand man was now the one holding a knife to her throat. That night, no one in my husband's house slept. Scar and his men waited outside in silence, but their presence was enough to keep anyone from daring to turn off the lights. Inside, Mr. Arthur clutched his chest, struggling to breathe. My mother-in-law cried until she had no voice left. Charles ran his hands through his hair, and Jessica sat paralyzed, staring at her phone screen. Everything they had tried to hide had finally exploded, and this time, there was no Ella Davis to pick up the pieces. While Anderson and Sons descended into chaos, I didn't allow myself to linger watching the wreckage. There were matters now in the hands of my lawyer, evidence that had been sent where it needed to go, and people who had to take responsibility for their actions. I, for my part, had to move forward. Not with resentment, but by building a new, cleaner, and clearer path, where no one could use the word family to cover up deceit. In just a few days, alongside Beth, Andy, Daniel, and Laura, we completed the first steps to open the new company. The name, Trustline Projects, I wrote on a whiteboard in our first small meeting. There was no grand opening, no ribbons, no flowers, and no fake congratulations. We simply rented a modest office on the third floor of an old building, set up some desks, installed internet, built the data system, and stayed late to assign tasks. From the beginning, I made it clear to everyone. We will not take a single asset from Anderson & Sons, no client data illegally, nor will we use tricks to poach staff. Whoever comes to us must do so because they believe in our way of working, not because we snatch them from others. Beth nodded. Her voice was firm. If we're starting over, let's do it right. I'm tired of pretty numbers on paper and an empty shell inside. Andy, beside her, just said briefly, "In my warehouse, if a single screw is missing from now on, there will be a report." I didn't have much money to start big, but I had experience, my personal reputation, and a network of reliable suppliers I had built over the years. Not all of them dared to collaborate immediately, fearing they would be drawn into the conflict between my ex-husband and me. I understood, so in every call, I was very clear. I'm not asking you to take my side. I'm just inviting you to do business with transparency. Quality products, real prices, and clear payments. The launch of Trustline Projects took place in a small room with just the 5 of us, 2 trusted suppliers, and some cups of hot tea. I stood in front of the whiteboard, looked at the faces of those who had walked through the most difficult days with me, and said, I don't promise this company will grow fast. I also don't promise it won't be hard. But I do promise that here, no one will have to falsify data to please family. No one will have to sign blank papers to cover a boss's mistakes, and no one will be used as a scapegoat for the greed of others. Laura was the one who posted the introduction of Trustline Projects on social media. It wasn't a long text, nor did it dwell on the past. It simply wrote about our independent quality control process, transparency in quotes, commitment to not using low-quality products, and a 24-hour customer response policy. To my surprise, many former clients shared the post. Someone commented, I worked with Ella. She's strict, but very clear. Another wrote to me privately. If it's Ella's team, I trust them. 2 days later, I received a call from Mr. Thompson, the representative from Solstice Hospitality Group. When I saw his number, I was silent for a few seconds before answering. He got straight to the point. Mrs. Davis, we don't need Anderson & Sons. We need someone truly competent to manage the project. I didn't rejoice hastily or accept immediately. I understood that $1 million contract was not a gift, nor something to boast about. I replied clearly. If Solstice wants to work with Trustline Projects, I have 3 conditions. First, an independent audit of all purchases. Second, the contract must clearly specify the responsibilities of each party. And third, we will not, under any circumstances, use low-quality materials, even if the profit is lower. Mr. Thompson was silent for a few seconds and then said, That is precisely why we called you. With that single sentence, I knew a new door had truly opened. The news that Solstice was negotiating with my company quickly reached the ears of Anderson & Sons. Upon hearing it, Jessica screamed in the middle of the office. She stole my client. She stepped on her husband's family to climb up. But this time, her screams no longer scared anyone. My lawyer sent a very brief response. Clients have the right to choose a new supplier. There is no evidence of unfair competition. We request that you cease these slanderous remarks. At the same time, many of the good employees remaining at Anderson & Sons submitted their resignations. They didn't come directly to my company to avoid legal issues, and I didn't ask them to. But I learned that before they left, several said the same thing. We don't want to go down with dishonest people. A company can recover from losing money, but when it loses all its decent people, only an empty shell remains. That afternoon, Jack came to see me again. This time, he didn't beg me to return to the company. He handed me the signed divorce petition and placed it gently on the table. He had lost a lot of weight, and his sunken eyes no longer had that evasive look from before. He said, I was right to lose you. I'm not asking you to forgive me anymore, but I'm asking you to save my parents from that debt. I looked at the paper and then at the man who had been my husband. I felt a little pity, but there was no weakness left in me. I said, I can show them the legal path, but but I will not pay the price for them." Jack lowered his head without replying. Perhaps for the first time, he understood that I was no longer the woman who always silently picked up the broken pieces of the Anderson family. That night, I sent Jack a list of the evidence he should present. The predatory loan agreement, the statements of transfers to intermediary accounts, Marcus's messages, the false documents, and the key points he should report to prove that the money had been diverted by Jessica and Marcus. I warned him to go with a lawyer, not to negotiate on his own, and not to sign anything else. I didn't do it out of affection for his family. I did it because I wanted everything to end according to the law. Whoever did wrong should pay, and the innocent should not be dragged down with them. And I already had trust-line projects. I had people who believed in me and a new path ahead. This time, I was no longer in anyone's shadow. I was acting under my own name. 3 months later, Anderson & Sons was officially placed under investigation. The company sign still hung, but the glass door, once lit late into the night, was now locked tight. The trucks that used to come and go were covered in dust in a corner. From the outside, it just looked like a bankrupt company. But those of us who had been inside knew it didn't collapse from a gust of wind, but from the cracks that had been hidden for too long. Jessica was summoned to testify several times to clarify the false invoices, the inflated purchase prices, the unauthorized use of internal accounts, and the shady loan with loan sharks. Marcus, after being on the run for a while, was found at an acquaintance's house. On his computer were all the conversations, the records of the money distribution, the forged documents, and the messages with Jessica's orders. Sarah also had to explain her involvement in altering data, changing the status of customer complaints, and dressing up customer service reports. Charles, the man who only signed papers trusting his wife would handle everything, ended up taking the most responsibility as the legal administrator of the company. They say he broke down very quickly, that his hair visibly grayed in a few months. My father-in-law fell ill after the shock of losing the company, the mortgaged house, and his trust in those he had defended. One day, Jack wrote to me to say his father wanted to apologize. I read the message for a long time and only replied, "I hope he takes care of himself." My mother-in-law also called me once. It was the first time she didn't call to shout at me, or give me orders, or blame me for being heartless. On the other end of the line, her voice was much hoarser. She cried like someone who finally understands that what they've lost is not just money. She said, "Ella, I was wrong. I thought family was the most important thing, but it turns out an outsider like you was the one holding this house together." I was silent for a few seconds. I no longer felt anger, but I also wasn't weak enough to go back to being her old daughter-in-law. I just told her, I was not an outsider. I was family. But you were the one who threw me out. On the other end, there was silence. I heard her choke back a sob, and she couldn't say anything more. The call ended softly, but for me, it was like closing a long and exhausting chapter of my life. The divorce between Jack and me was finalized shortly after. The shared assets were divided according to the legal agreement. My $50,000 contribution to Anderson & Sons was recognized as a substantiated contribution, and the family had to repay it to me on a payment plan after the liquidation of their assets. Jack signed all the papers in silence. Before leaving, he said, "I'm sorry for leaving you alone for so long." I looked at him and nodded slightly. Some apologies come too late to repair the damage, but they are enough to stop blaming each other. I did not gloat over his family's downfall. To be honest, some nights I still felt sad. After all, I had invested my youth, my trust, and the simple hopes of a woman who wanted to build a family there. But I also didn't soften and go back. Feeling pity for others does not mean throwing yourself into the abyss once more. 6 months later, Trustline Projects signed its first major contract with Solstice Hospitality Group. Without noise or fanfare, just an orderly and clear contract signing. Each clause was read carefully, each commitment written on paper. Beth handled the finances with complete transparency in every income and expense. Andy rebuilt the warehouse system with strict control of every item. Daniel developed the new management platform, and Laura led the customer service team with the patience for which she had been previously looked down upon. In our first results meeting, I looked at the people who had walked with me through the rubble. They weren't perfect, but they were decent, hardworking, and afraid of doing the wrong thing. I told them, we didn't win out of revenge. We won by not being dishonest. As I said that, I saw Laura's eyes redden. And Beth turned to discreetly wipe away a tear. Perhaps we all understood that the most valuable thing, after all, was not the contract, but being able to work in a place that doesn't force you to betray your conscience. A year later, Trustline Projects became a trusted partner in the industry. The company didn't grow as fast as Anderson and Sons boasted in its good times, but it grew solidly and steadily. Clients returned because they trusted us. I once passed by the old headquarters of Anderson and Sons. The sign had been taken down. The windows were covered in dust, and the inside was dark. I stopped for a few seconds, remembering the years I left my sweat there. Strangely, I no longer felt pain or nostalgia, only relief. If Jessica hadn't fired me that day, maybe I would still be deceiving myself, thinking that with enough effort, people would eventually be grateful. But there are places where the longer you stay, the more they consume you. And there are times when being pushed out, even if it feels like you're losing everything, turns out to be life's way of opening a way out for you. I left my husband's family, I left that company, I left that marriage, but I didn't lose everything. I just gave them back the things that were never truly worthy of what I deserved. And I, Ella Davis, started over, cleanly, decently, and with my head held high.